Jesus and his disciples passed through Galilee. He did not want anyone to know it, for he was teaching his disciples, saying to them, "The Son of Man is to be betrayed into human hands, and they will kill him, and 3 days after being killed, he will rise again." But they did not understand what he was saying, and were afraid to ask him. Then they came to Capernaum, and when he was in the house, he asked them, "What were you arguing about on the way?" But they were silent, for on the way they had argued with one another who was the greatest. He sat down, called the 12, and said to them, "Whoever wants to be first must be last of all and servant of all." Then he took a little child and put it among them, and taking it in his arms, he said to them, "Whoever welcomes one such child in my name welcomes me. And whoever welcomes me welcomes not me, but the one who sent me." The Gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, Lord Christ.
Please be seated. All right, I know you're all going to understand this one. You're on a long trip, and all of a sudden, you hear in the back seat, "Dad, he just touched me." "Mom, I gotta go. He's looking at me. Make him stop looking at me." And you can all join me on this one. Are we there yet? Yeah, how much longer can we stop? Right? I see McDonald's. The Golden Arches are calling my name. Right? We think that that's a modern problem. Well, by God, if the disciples weren't doing it back in the day. Right? Jesus is walking along, and behind him, he hears the kibitzing between the disciples. "Peter, you think you're all important?" "Andrew, I'm the one that's important." "Andrew, you are nothing but a fisherman." Hey, watch that language. Can you hear them? They're all kibitzing back and forth. Who's more important? Which one of us is going to be at the right and the left hand of Jesus? And what does Jesus do? He gives them the old flop on the back of the head, doesn't he? And he says, "Everybody sit down." And out of the mist, he pulls a little child, and he says, This is what's important." Now, for us, we're surrounded by little kids, right? We're surrounded by children. And for us, our children are our hearts and our souls. And when you see a little baby, oh my gosh, it doesn't get any better than that, does it? Right? It's like having a puppy. You see a little baby, and everybody's got to hold them, cuddle them, smell them, because they have that baby smell, right? But that's not the way it was back in the day. Back in Jesus' day, children were lower than livestock. They were a burden to society. They were a burden on the family. And so it's profound when Jesus chooses a child to say that this is what's important. Because a child, if they ate, but they weren't big enough to work in the fields, they weren't big enough to have a trade. And so at that point, they were a burden still. And you always hear about the orphans and the widows. And so you had a lot of kids because they died. Death was common. And if the parents died, well, then the orphan became a burden to society, because then who was going to feed the kids? And so Jesus takes this burden, this obstacle, and says, this is not an obstacle, this is not a burden, this is an opportunity. This is where our focus should be. And so it's the beginning of radical welcoming, radical invitation. And he chooses this lesson to teach the disciples in secret so that it can't be interrupted. It's that important to Jesus. that he sits the disciples down in a home that nobody knows they're there because he really wants them to hear today's lesson. He really wants them to hear this message of radical welcoming. And so I've been sitting with this whole idea of radical welcoming. And what does that mean for St. Bartholomew's? How do we radically welcome people into our home here at St. Bartholomew's, into this church home and this church family that we have? Well, in the earlier liturgies, I stand outside. I'm pretty sure I might be the only clergy member in all North Augusta that stands outside on a 95-degree day to welcome everybody. But it's important that we welcome and we open the doors of our church for our guests and for you as our guests. What are some other ideas? This is engagement now, folks. What are some other ideas of radical welcoming? We do it pretty well in here. I had to teach the other liturgies. But at the exchange of peace, what do? We peace out before we peace in, right? You share the sign of peace with somebody outside of your immediate family, and then you turn in to your family. You welcome the visitor in your life before you welcome your family, because they're there. They know you're going to get to them. But the guest and the visitor who's sitting by themselves, maybe not so much. What are some other ideas? I got one for you. The Cornerstone Foundation. You might go, Mother Nan, what does that have to do with anything? Well, the Cornerstone Foundation is you give money out of your will to the church. It's not impacting your Starbucks budget. It's not impacting your livelihood. It's impacting your children, right? Your heirs. But they'll get over it. It's okay. But what it does is it sustains the church. It guarantees that St. Bartholomew's is going to be here for Cooper's grandchildren and for Elijah's grandchildren. That's what the Cornerstone does. That's a form of welcoming, because we're making sure that the church that we have, that feeds us, that we enjoy, that we call our church home, will be here long beyond us. Here's a good idea. How about if we welcome somebody to a Bible study? That would be a good idea. How about if we welcome somebody and say, hey, I'm going to go buy my pumpkin at the best pumpkin patch in all of North Augusta over at St. Bartholomew's. Why don't you come with me? Oh, we hate evangelism in the Episcopal Church. We itch when we hear that word. But it's easy. It's easy. We're going to have all kinds of fellowship coming up here in the fall. Invite a neighbor. If you got a neighbor that you know is not going to church, just invite him to come along. I promise I won't sales pitch, I promise. And if you're working the pumpkin patch, because you know we're all pumpkin now, right? October, it's all things pumpkin. So if you're working the pumpkin patch, upsell. Everybody know what I mean by upsell? My salesman in the audience, right? In the congregation, upsell. How do you upsell a pumpkin? Hey, that's a great pumpkin, but we have a great liturgy on Sundays. We're doing this really fun Bible study. That's upselling in the church. Okay? They walk away with a pumpkin, and then they come back on a Sunday. That's a bonus like you can't get here on earth, right? It's radical. And Jesus, it's so important to Jesus that he tells his disciples how to do this, because that's the future of the church, and we've lost that. Because when we welcome people into the church, we welcome them into our lives, into our hearts. I stand here all Sunday morning, and I see the smiles, and I see the gentle hugs, and the handshakes, and the how are you doing? How's the husband? How's the wife? How are the kids? How's the dog? I hear it all Sunday morning. And I think they come with their bodies, but they bring their hearts and they bring their souls, and that's where you let it flow, is in this place. And that's what you're upselling. That's what you're inviting other people into. Come in and share this moment with us. radical welcoming. It's what is going to get us through the next millennium. It's what's going to get us through the chaos that we feel outside these doors. Don't keep it the best secret in all of St. Bartholomew's. Go out there and spread the word.